Mary Harriet Brown Abrams lived from 1851 to 1914. This is her obituary, published the day after her death. Woman pioneer of Seattle dies. Mrs. Robert Abrams passes away in home she had occupied with her large family for 30 years. The passing of a pioneer, whose name has been linked with the development of Seattle for the past 43 years, was recorded last night in the death of Mrs. Mary Harriet Abrams, wife of Robert Abrams, 44 Roanoke Street. Mrs. Abrams died at 9:30 o'clock in the house which has been the home of her family for 30 years. She was 61 years old. For many years, Mrs. Abrams has been identified with the church and club life of the city. She was long a teacher in the Sunday school of the Plymouth Church, and many prominent women of Seattle were her pupils. She served also as president of the Clionian Club, was active in the YWCA, the Pioneers Society, the Washington State Art Association, and many other organizations. Mrs. Abrams was born on board her father's vessel, then in the Sea of Okhotsk, off the Siberian coast, in 1861. She came to Seattle in 1881 from the Hawaiian Islands, married here, and has lived in this city continuously since that time. The immediate members of her family were present at the bedside when death came. She is survived by her husband, 3 sons, Robert W. Abrams, Norman B. Abrams, president of the Seattle Automobile Club, and Richard H. Abrams, and by 3 daughters, Mrs. Joseph Caldwell, Mrs. M.J. O'Donnell, and Mrs. Arthur C. Lawley, Theophilus Brown of Seattle, Thomas Brown of Los Angeles, Mrs. Annie Spencer, Mrs. Roswell Cutler, Mrs. Lincoln D. Spencer, Mrs. Edith Parker of Seattle, and Mrs. Charlotte Haley of Wickersham are brothers and sisters who survive her. 19 surviving grandchildren live in this state. And here is Robert's obituary from 1922. Pioneer dies at age of 85. Funeral services for Robert Abrams, 85, pioneer real estate man, will be held at 2 p.m. Friday at Bonnie Watson's under the auspices of St. John's Lodge of Masons. Abrams died Wednesday at his home, 44 Roanoke St., after a residence of 64 years in Seattle. After making his way to Portland in 1855, Abrams rode horseback to Puget Sound, first coming to Seattle in 1858. While hunting deer in the woods near Renton, he discovered a vein of coal and began to mine it and haul it into Seattle. Later on, he started to deal in real estate. One of his ventures was the acquiring of a lot at 2nd Avenue and Washington Street for a team of horses and wagon and $400 cash. This he held for 40 years, then sold it to the Seattle Brewing and Malting Company for $400,000. 6 children survive Abrams.